SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As part of that goal, we have partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SBP has 5 interventions: building efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. We ask that you please join us for our future webinars. The links to register and QR code will be available in the slides we send out later today. Additionally, we have a few upcoming events thanks to a generous grant from the Walmart Foundation. If you are interested in attending, please reach out to me for more information or simply use the link or QR code to register. We also have our finance leader course in New Orleans. This 2.5 day course is built to help finance leaders to state disaster recovery programs be as effective and efficient as possible in addressing enduring communities' recovery needs. And a disaster housing course in Savannah. This 2-day course has a wide range of key topics to equip leaders to be effective and efficient construction managers. There is a cost per seat to attend these courses. If you are interested, please reach out to me or simply use the link or QR code on the slide to register. Social media is one of the easiest ways to keep up with what the Advise team is doing, so we ask that you follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Now I will pass it over to our disaster recovery advisor, Joshua Bryant.
Hey, good morning, and thank you, Maria. Today we're covering a high-level overview of FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, or BRIC. This webinar is meant to introduce you to the BRIC program and to provide a foundation for how to access the program in the future. As Maria mentioned, my name is Joshua Bryant, and I'm serving as a disaster recovery advisor at SBP. Before joining SBP, I worked as a recovery division chief for the state of Texas, where I was responsible for the disaster declaration process, securing federal recovery funding, and managing multi-billion-dollar recovery grants. Next slide, please. During our time together this morning, we will focus on 3 topic areas. First, we'll begin by providing an overview of the BRIC program and some quick facts about the funds distributed to date under the program. Next, we'll review the program and project eligibility requirements. And then finally, we'll discuss resources for assistance that can help your communities access the BRIC program. Next slide, please. Before we jump into BRIC specifically, I did want to generally introduce you to hazard mitigation as a topic. Hazard mitigation is one of the foundational phases of emergency management. It focuses on reducing or eliminating long-term risks posed by natural or human-caused disasters or hazards before they occur. And it may involve both structural or non-structural measures taken to potentially save lives and property. It is an ongoing process, and it aims to break the cycle of damage and repair in hazardous areas, especially as the costs of disasters and impacts continue to rise and some communities become more susceptible to hazards and risk. Next slide, please. FEMA does have several programs aimed to fund resilience activities for state and local governments. There are 4 programs specifically funded under FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, and these include the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and Hazard Mitigation Grant Program Post-Fire. Both of these programs are funded after a presidential disaster declaration is issued under the Stafford Act, and is meant to assist the state and local governments in providing mitigation measures following a disaster. There are also two pre-disaster mitigation grant programs. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, which provides funds annually for projects and for planning purposes to reduce or eliminate flood risk, to damage or to potentially susceptible buildings that are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. And then the topic of today's webinar, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, or BRIC, which will focus on the program specifics during the rest of our time this morning. Next slide, please. So starting off, the BRIC program is relatively new, and it replaced a legacy pre-disaster mitigation program that FEMA used to administer. It was established by FEMA formally in fiscal year 2020, but it was allowed following the passage of the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act, or more commonly known as DARA, of 2018. This allowance in DARA provides for competitive grants to be issued to states, local governments, tribal governments, and territorial governments for pre-disaster mitigation activities. Typically, the federal government will cover 75% of eligible cost under the BRIC program, but there are allowances in BRIC that they may cover as much as 90% of eligible project costs for communities that are economically disadvantaged rural communities, which we'll define a little later on in this webinar in more detail. In general, though, these are communities that have fewer than 3,000 people, with residents having an average per capita annual income not exceeding 80% of the national per capita income. The BRIC program specifically seeks to fund effective and innovative projects that will reduce risk and increase resilience. And it also helps to or hopes to serve as a catalyst to encourage the whole community to invest and adopt policies related to mitigation. Next slide, please. Under the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, or DARA, FEMA is allowed to set aside 6% of the estimated amount of disaster assistance for pre-disaster hazard mitigation activities. Generally, these funds are set aside from the total cost of FEMA's individual assistance program and public assistance programs on a nationwide annual basis. And once these total funds are set aside for the BRIC program and is calculated at that 6% rate, FEMA will determine the amount that will be available during the next application period for BRIC. FEMA will announce its determination in the annual NOFO, or Notice of Funding for the BRIC program. And this normally occurs in the fall of each year, around the October 1st timeframe. Next slide, please. FEMA's initial investment in BRIC was $500 million in fiscal year 2020, and then $1 billion in fiscal year 2021. We did see a significant jump in BRIC funds available in fiscal year 2022. To nearly $2.3 billion in available BRIC funding. But then the funding dropped back down to approximately $1 billion that was available in fiscal year 2023. That was due to a couple different things, a few different pieces of legislation, but also the amount of funds that were provided for under the COVID Stafford Act disaster declarations nationwide helped to increase the amount of BRIC funding that was available in that FY 2023 timeframe. While these were very significant investments, it is important to note there was a much greater demand for BRIC funds than what is being awarded. Application totals have at least been double the amount of funds available each year since the program's inception. And in the most recent Notice of Funding FY 2023, applications totaled approximately $5.6 billion. And so we're continuing to see a growth and interest in the BRIC program, and funding has remained relatively steady since the inception. Next slide, please. Some quick highlights about 2023 BRIC applications. Specifically, over 1,200 sub-applications were received into FEMA, totaling more than the aforementioned $5.6 billion in resilience projects. 133 applications specifically targeted building code plus ups, which was a new opportunity under the BRIC program that we'll talk about in more detail later. And then 164 requests were received for direct technical assistance, which provides tailored non-financial support to communities and tribal nations to enhance their capabilities and capacity for climate resilient planning and hazard mitigation project designs, which we'll also talk about in a subsection later. Next slide, please. Now that we've highlighted kind of the basis of the BRIC program and where it came from, I did want to jump into program and project eligibility requirements, which is where we'll spend the majority of our time this morning. Next slide. So unlike other federal assistance programs, such as FEMA's IA program or public assistance programs, individuals such as property owners or business owners or private nonprofit organizations, with very few exceptions, may not apply directly to any of the FEMA hazard mitigation assistance programs that are authorized under the Stafford Act. It is the role of states, federally recognized tribes, territories to apply for this funding. And these entities have established mitigation priorities in their hazard mitigation plans to help guide which type of sub-applications are selected and passed through to FEMA from a state, tribal, or territorial perspective. These entities are tasked with facilitating the development of sub-applications from local jurisdictions and to apply on behalf of local jurisdictions to the FEMA hazard mitigation assistance programs, which includes BRIC, based on their pre-established criteria and available assistance that's issued through the NOFO. This is, next slide, please. This is important because it's good to understand both terminology and roles when it comes to the FEMA programs. Through the rest of today's webinar, you'll hear me talk a lot about applicants or sub-applicants or recipients or sub-recipients. Please know that an applicant or a recipient is generally a state, tribal, or territorial government and the pass-through entity, and then a sub-applicant or sub-recipient is generally considered a qualifying local government that receives funding. So states and territories that have had a major disaster declaration under the Stafford Act in the 7 years prior to the annual BRIC application period start date will be eligible to apply for FEMA assistance under the BRIC program. And so these would be the aforementioned applicants, and currently all states and territories are eligible to apply for assistance under the BRIC program because all 50 states, the District of Columbia, the 5 U.S. territories received Stafford Act declarations under the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that 7-year window is still open to basically all states and territories in the U.S. Federally recognized tribal governments may apply directly to FEMA for federal assistance under the BRIC program as an applicant, or they can apply through the state that they reside in as a sub-applicant as well. Next slide, please. 42 U.S. Code, Chapter 42 of the U.S. Code defines what constitutes a local entity and who may be eligible for assistance to submit sub-applications under the BRIC program. Common examples of local government entities that qualify as sub-applicants or sub-recipients include county governments, municipalities, cities, towns, school districts, special districts, councils of governments, a rural community, or an unincorporated town or village. And then, as mentioned previously, individuals, business owners, and nonprofit organizations are not eligible to apply for BRIC, but they may be part of an otherwise eligible entity application process. And so if you're part of a nonprofit organization or a business that's interested in participating in a BRIC program, I encourage you to work with your local government to best find out how you can fit within their application process for future BRIC applications. Next slide, please. Additional applicant and sub-applicant eligibility requirements that communities with project applications under the BRIC program must consider for any project application for work that will occur in a special flood hazard area. Applicants and participants must be a part of the National Flood Insurance Program. And then very importantly, applicants and sub-applicants are required to have a FEMA approved and adopted hazard mitigation plan by the application deadline and at the time of funding obligation. A lapse in a FEMA approved mitigation plan may result in a temporary hold and any additional obligations until the mitigation plan regains FEMA approval. And it will generally be basis for a non-decision or non-approval if an application is received for a locality that doesn't have a mitigation plan or the plan has been lapsed in approval. Next slide, please. This is important because the mitigation plan is the representation of the local jurisdiction's commitment to reduce risk from natural hazards and serves as a guide for decision makers as they commit resources to reducing the effects of natural hazards. Local plans will also serve as the basis for the state to provide technical assistance and prioritize project funding. Specific plan requirements can be found under 44 CFR 201.6, which specifies that the local hazard mitigation plan should contain documentation of the planning process, a risk assessment, a mitigation strategy, a plan maintenance process, and then documentation showing that the plan has been formally adopted. If you need help with the mitigation planning, there's some resources that we'll talk about in the next few slides, but also please reach out to us after this webinar and we'll put you in contact with the right points of contact that can help you create and build a local hazard mitigation plan. Next slide, please. All right, so there are 4 different types of uses for BRIC program funds that eligible applicants and sub-applicants can apply for. These include non-financial technical assistance, capability and capacity building activities, mitigation projects that are designed to increase resilience and public safety, reduce injury, loss of life, and damage and destruction of property. Any eligible and reasonable indirect, direct, administrative cost or other administrative assistance, or excuse me, administrative expenses associated with a specific mitigation measure or project. Next slide, please. Regardless of the type of assistance a BRIC sub-applicant pursues, each sub-application will undergo various phases of project development, scoping, and review. This process is aimed at selecting potential activities based on the current community needs and the most appropriate mitigation activity that best addresses the vulnerabilities associated with the hazards identified in the hazard mitigation plan. I'll talk about this more later, but to receive a more in-depth understanding of this application submittal process, I encourage you to work with your state hazard mitigation officers. It is possible that the application process varies slightly by state based on systems used. And so we'll help you get in contact with your local state hazard mitigation officer for very specific application review processes. Next slide, please. Additionally, regardless of the type of assistance pursued, to be eligible for the BRIC program, all activities must conform with applicable state, local, and federal environmental, historical preservation, and floodplain laws. They must conform with all applicable FEMA policies and directives, including 44 CFR. They must not duplicate activities another federal agency or program has a more specific authority to conduct. Examples of this would be work that should or could be conducted under FEMA's hazard mitigation, or excuse me, FEMA's public assistance program, or work that is the legal responsibility of the Federal Highways Administration. And finally, all work or sub-applications must conform with 2 CFR Part 200, which outlines the administrative requirements for federal grant awards. Next slide, please. All right, diving into the specific types of assistance, we'll start with non-financial technical assistance available under the BRIC program. The purpose of this type of assistance is to support communities while they enhance their capability and capacity for climate resilience planning and hazard mitigation project designs. Successful recipients of these funds may receive support for up to 36 months. And FEMA offers wide-ranging assistance, including climate risk assessment, community engagement, partnership building, mitigation planning, and project solution design. Really is meant to serve as a foundational starting point for lower capacity communities in order to enter the BRIC program and begin to build their hazard mitigations and resilience capabilities. Next slide, please. Support for BRIC technical assistance communities can range from pre-application activities to grant closeout support. And FEMA is focused on removing barriers to funding access, especially for disadvantaged communities. As such, FEMA will prioritize assistance for Justice 40 initiative communities, federally recognized tribal communities, disadvantaged communities as identified by the CGES tool, economically disadvantaged rural communities, and then CEDARS communities. FEMA is also prioritizing requests that focuses on nature-based solutions and building code adoption and/or enforcement. Next slide, please. All right, next, BRIC funds may be used for capability and capacity building activities. Examples of eligible activities under this category includes mitigation planning, partnership building, risk assessments, project scoping, and community outreach and engagement. As opposed to technical assistance, this is a funded program activity, means funding is passed through to the sub-applicant in order to complete this work. And for the FY 2023 grant cycle, FEMA also introduced a new building code plus up opportunity, which provides funds specifically for adopting and enforcing hazard resistant building codes. FEMA received over $52 million in applications, sub-applications specifically for this opportunity during the last application period, and anticipates that this subcategory will continue to grow in future years. Next slide, please. Capability and capacity building activities should result in a resource strategy or tangible mitigation product that will reduce or eliminate risk and damage from future natural disasters. It should increase resilience and public safety, or it should promote a culture of preparedness. Some of these activities may include risk assessments, public outreach and engagement activities, the coordination of meetings and workshops with a mitigation nexus, evaluating technical feasibility for a mitigation project, or training and resources to support the adoption and enforcement of updated codes and standards. It's important to note that any already initiated or completed capability and capacity building activities are not eligible for funding in the future. Next slide, please. All right, FEMA may award competitive financial assistance for cost-effective mitigation projects designed to increase resilience and public safety and to reduce injury, loss of life, and damage and destruction of property, including damage to critical services and facilities. These may include infrastructure projects like flood walls and drainage improvements. They may be nature-based solutions like the restoration of forest or wetlands. They may be resilience projects like installing backup power sources or building retrofits, or they may be residential mitigation projects like the elevation of structures above the base flood levels or building community rooms. These programs prioritize large infrastructure projects that can have a transformative impact on community resilience. And is generally the most popular type of funding that's available under the BRIC program. Next slide, please. Mitigation projects specifically must align with the state and local approved hazard mitigation plan. They must conform to the latest relevant consensus-based codes, specifications, and standards. They must be technically feasible and effective. They must solve a problem independently or constitute a functional portion of a long-term solution for a problem. And they must be cost-effective and designed to increase resilience and reduce risk. And then very similar to the capability and capacity building activities, any work that is already underway is not eligible for reimbursement as a mitigation project under the BRIC program. And so these are our start from scratch projects. Next slide, please. The BRIC program encourages innovative projects that incorporate nature-based solutions, enhance climate resilience, and facilitate regional partnerships, as well as benefit disadvantaged communities. There are numerous examples of eligible hazard mitigation projects from across the country. I've included a few on the screen for your review, but these types of projects generally align with the same eligibility requirements that are available under FEMA mitigation programs like the post-disaster HMGP program. And at its core, these projects should be designed to help solve a problem for the disaster-prone community. And so is building something to decrease risk for future disasters is really the basis of eligibility here. Next slide, please. And then finally, managing these types of projects and this type of work can be a heavy lift for state and local governments. And so under the program, FEMA allows applicants and sub-applicants to apply for management cost under the BRIC program. A total of 15% of the total eligible grant award is available for eligible and reasonable indirect costs, direct administrative costs, and other administrative expenses associated with specific mitigation measures or a project. Subrecipients specifically, and so non-state sub-applicants, may be eligible to apply for up to 5% of their total BRIC subaward amount. FEMA provides these funds at 100% federal funding, meaning there's not a cost share for management costs. And the subrecipient will still have to provide similar project documentation to support these costs as they would for their normal project work. These funds are meant to help fund activities such as compliance with quarterly reporting, monitoring and payment of contractors or vendors, and then closeout requirements or appeal requirements that are available under the program. Next slide, please. And as we begin to wrap up the slide portion of this webinar, I did want to point you towards a few additional resources for assistance. Today, we provided a brief summary of the BRIC program and highlighted the program and project elements that are foundational to understanding BRIC. But as you all know, like many of FEMA's recovery and mitigation programs, there are a lot of very specific rules, regulations, and policies that govern the BRIC program application process, project management, and project closeout. And so next slide, please, Maria. Did want to point out FEMA's website has a variety of materials, including policies, past notices of funding or NOFOs, and then informational videos that may be helpful as your community prepares to apply or submit a BRIC application. But I mentioned this earlier, for general questions about BRIC in your home state, I do encourage any eligible applicants to work with their state hazard mitigation officer or their FEMA regional office contacts to answer these questions specifically. These points of contacts will be able to provide you with the most up-to-date information about the BRIC program specific to your state, such as past funding and future application deadlines. But additionally, they'll be able to provide you with specific administrative guidance for the BRIC program, as mentioned, which may vary slightly from state to state. If you need help finding your state hazard mitigation officer or FEMA regional office, please reach out after this webinar and we'll be sure to help you find the right person or office. And SBP has people in place that can make you or can help you make that contact. Next slide, please. And then finally, I wanted to talk about one additional program. As Maria mentioned, SPP's mission is to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. We believe that empowering local governments to increase their local capacity is one of the best ways to accomplish this mission. And so with this in mind, SPP has begun placing resilience and recovery fellows in small to medium-sized communities around the country in order to improve local capacity and increase the amount of resources flowing into a community. These fellows come at no cost to the community, and they serve in 2-year terms with the intent to find opportunities, excuse me, and funding for their communities that will help reduce the risk posed by future disasters. Next slide, please. Currently, SPP has 5 fellows placed in communities, and we are in the process of placing additional 8 communities before the end of the year, with more to come in 2025. If your community is interested in hearing more about the fellows program and what qualifies to have a fellow placed in your community, please let us know after this webinar, and we'll connect you with the right program manager within SPP to begin that conversation. Next slide, please. And then for any additional questions or context that you have that you want to follow up after this webinar, please find my email on the screen. It's jbryant@sppusa.org. And I'll be happy to answer any questions one-on-one with you or your community. And with that, I want to thank you for your participation today in the webinar. If you have any questions, please chime in now or type it into the chat and we'll be sure to get to it. And with that, Maria, I will pass it back to you.
Okay, hey Josh, there is a question in the Q&A box. Can you see it on your end?
And give me just a second to read it. Yeah, Michelle, that's something I really am not prepared to go into detail on this call, but I will follow up with this group regarding the scoring criteria for building codes with a 1-pager, half-pager, and I'll make sure to have that pushed out by this afternoon.
Okay, I think that's the only question that we had. Thank you so much, Josh. As a reminder, we ask you to please join us for our future webinars. Also, don't forget to register today to attend one of our courses that you see here on the screen. If you are interested in learning more about SBP Advise offerings, please contact us at advise@sbpusa.org. And as a reminder, please don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. We look forward to meeting with you on future webinars or in person at one of our courses. We will be emailing out the slide deck from today, so look out for that in your inbox. Thank you again on behalf of SBP and the Walmart Foundation. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.